And good evening and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. Woo! Come on, guys, you can do better than that. Guys, we are 2 weeks away now. There's going to be a shir tonight where we're going to hopefully do Masechet Chagigah chapters 1 and 2. And then next week, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to complete Masechet Chagigah, and at the same time, we are going to complete the whole of Seder Moed. So, this is huge. This is huge. We've come a long way, considering that we started around a year ago. I don't even think we've done a year yet. So it's really quite an amazing accomplishment. We started with Masechet Brachas, if you recall, and then we jumped into Seder Moed, and we are now going to finish it next week. And I'm thinking that we are going to try and incorporate a siyum for Seder Moed and a siyum for Daf Yomi Psachim. At the same time on the fast of the firstborn. That's what I'm thinking we're going to do, so we can try and get it with a minion. It's not necessarily going to be as festive as we deserve, but I think it will be nice to be able to at least say the formula of completion and to be able to say a Kaddish over it. I think all being well, that's the hope and that's the plan, and that will be streamed first thing in the morning on the fast for the firstborn. So let's just hope I wake up in time. If not, Dan, over to you. Okay, so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's get Chagigah up on the screen for you here, and also, if you're good, we'll even put it on YouTube as well. There we go. So, Masechet Chagigah, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 1. We're going to be dealing with Yom Tov, elements of Yom Tov, and specifically we're going to break it into two parts. So the first, call it half of the Masechta, from chapter 1 through to chapter 2, Mishnah 5, we'll be talking about halachas regarding coming to the Beis HaMikdash and korbanos. Because there was actually a chiyuv, there was an obligation for Jewish men to present themselves 3 times a year, which was called Re'iyah. They had to go 3 times a year on the Shalosh Regalim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos. And when they went, they would bring a korban olas Re'iyah. They would bring an olah, which would be burnt up in its entirety. And that was a special korban that was brought on the occasion of presenting oneself in the Beis HaMikdash. And then from chapter 2, Mishnah 5 until the end, there are halachot of tumah and tahara, of ritual purity, and being able to bring korbanos in the Beis HaMikdash. So we deal first, as we said, with the halachas about coming to the Beis HaMikdash and the sacrifices. And the first Mishnah in Mishnah Aleph is actually going to talk about who doesn't have to come to the Beis HaMikdash. So we start off in the following way with chapter 1, Mishnah 1, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. Says the Mishnah, Hakol chayavin b're'iyah. Everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah. Everyone is obligated in being present at the Beis HaMikdash. What are the exceptions? Chutz, except for mecheresh. A cheresh is someone who is deaf and can't speak, otherwise known on the screen there as a deaf mute. Shoter is someone who is in some ways, I guess, has a mental handicap of some description. V'katan, and a minor, someone under the age of bar mitzvah. V'tumtum is a hermaphrodite, is somebody who presents with both sets of genitalia. And androgynous is someone who presents with neither sign of genitalia. V'nashim, women are exempt from the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year. Va'avadim she'einam meshuchrarim, as are servants who have not been freed. Chagigah is someone who is lame and would not be able to comfortably make the journey. V'hasuma, someone who is blind. V'achole, someone who is ill. V'zakein, someone who is elderly. Umi she'eno yachol la'alos b'raglav, and anyone who is just unable to get up to Yerushalayim of his own accord. So the Mishnah asks, Ezehu katan, what are the criteria of a katan who is not supposed to or not needing to come up to Yerushalayim? Kol she'enu yachol lirkov al kaseifav shel aviv v'la'alos miYerushalayim lahar habayis. Divrei Beis Shammai. So according to Beis Shammai, it's anyone who would be unable to ride on his father's shoulders in order to go up to the Temple Mount. That's the opinion of Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel omrim, Beis Hillel say, Kol she'enu yachol le'echos biyado shel aviv, anyone who is unable to hold his father's hand, v'la'alos miYerushalayim lahar habayis, and handle the walk up to Har Habayis. Shne'emar, as it says in the pasuk, Shalosh Regalim. So we call them the 3 foot festivals because Beis Hillel learn out from this verse that there's an obligation to use one's legs when going up to Jerusalem. And if you're unable to use your legs, then you would not be included in the obligation to present oneself in the temple compound. So when you get to the Beis HaMikdash, there are different korbanos, there are different sacrifices that they would have had to bring. There would be 2 compulsory sacrifices and there would be 1 voluntary sacrifice. So the compulsory sacrifices, one is the Olat Hara'iyah, is the Olah, which would be burnt up in its entirety for being present at the Beis HaMikdash. The second is a Shalmei Chagigah, which is a Shlamim sacrifice in honor of the Chag, right? We're learning Maseches Chagigah because there's a korban called the Chagigah. And that fulfills the biblical mitzvah of Vesamachta Bechagecha, of rejoicing on your festivals. So, no, I'm sorry, it doesn't. Ignore that. So the Shalmei Chagigah, the Chagigah offering is a compulsory one, and the third one, I guess, is our voluntary one, unless I've really messed up over here, which is possible. And the third one is called the Shalmei Simcha, which is also a shlamim. It's the shlamim of Simcha, and with that one you would fulfill the mitzvah of Vesamachta Bechagecha, of rejoicing on the festival. So those are the 3 different types of korbanot that they would bring. Now, one second. Olat Re'iyah, Shalmei Chagigah. Yeah, these are the 2 compulsory ones, and then the third one is the Shalmei Simcha. So when it comes to the compulsory ones, you'll see there's no upper limit to the amount that you can spend, but there is a minimum requirement for how much you can spend. So this Mishnah is going to deal with the minimum price that you can spend on the compulsory, obligatory korbanot. So says the Mishnah, where are we? We're only in Mishnah base. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah base. Beis Shammai Omrim, Beis Shammai say, Hara'iyah shtei kesef, v'chagigah ma'a kesef. The minimum amount that you can spend on your re'iyah, on the korban for presenting in the Beis HaMikdash, is shtei kesef, is 2 silver coins. That's the minimum amount that you can spend. The Chagigah, and the minimum amount to spend on the Chagigah is 1 silver coin, a ma'ah. With Beis Hillel Omrim, Beis Hillel says, Hara'iyah ma'a kesef. The re'iyah has a minimum expense of 1 silver ma'ah, and the Chagigah shtei kesef. The Chagigah says the opposite, that there are 2 silver coins, which is the minimum for the korban Chagigah. Continuing with Mishnah Gimel. What money can you use to buy these korbanot with, to pay for these korbanot? Are you allowed to use sanctified money, or must you use money without any other sanctity? There's such a thing as paying with the money from Ma'aseh Sheni, the second tithe, which was brought as part of your tithings in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of any 7-year cycle. So that money could be taken to Yerushalayim, and it could so any fruit of Ma'aseh Sheni could be redeemed in exchange for money. That money could be taken to Yerushalayim, and then you could use that money in Yerushalayim to buy different things. The question is, can you use that money to buy any of these sacrifices? So we're going to see that the Re'iyah sacrifice cannot be used with Ma'aseh Sheni money. And there are 2 reasons for this. Number 1, you don't eat the Olat HaRe'iyah. It's given up entirely to the Mizbeach. And when it comes to the money of Ma'aseh Sheni, there's actually a requirement to benefit and to eat whatever you use that money for. So since you're going to be buying a sacrifice that doesn't get eaten, you can't use Ma'aseh Sheni money to buy it. And the second reason is because it's an obligatory korban. And so the money cannot come from Ma'aseh Sheni money. So says the Mishnah in Mishnah Gimel. With that introduction in mind, let us give it our best shot. Olos b'moed ba'os min hachulim. When it comes to the ola, burnt up sacrifices of a festival, ba'os min hachulim, the money must come from non-sacred cash, or from non-sacred property. V'hashlamim min hamasa. When it comes to buying the peace offerings, when it comes to buying the shlamim korbanot, that can be used with money that has been infused with the sanctity of Ma'aseh Sheni. Continues the Mishnah. Yom Tov Harishon Shel Pesach. When it comes to first day Pesach, the Mishnah says, Beis Shammai Omrim min hachulim, that when it comes to the Shalmei Chagigah of the first day of Pesach, Beis Shammai say it has to come from chulin, it has to come from non-sacred property. Beis Hillel Omrim min ha'maaseh. Beis Hillel say it can come from produce, from money that has the sanctity of Ma'aseh Sheni infused into it. The reason why Beis Shammai say that it has to come from chulin, that it has to come from unsanctified produce, is because once you've got sacrifices, obligatory sacrifices that can't come from Ma'aseh Sheni, so they hold that it all must therefore come from things that are not Ma'aseh Sheni, whereas Beis Hillel do not agree to this. If it's voluntary, then I believe Beis Hillel is saying that it can come from Ma'aseh Sheni. In Mishnah Dalet, we see the following: Yisrael yotzin yedei chavasan b'nedarim and adavos uv'maaseh behema. That Yisrael Jews can fulfill their obligations of eating shlamim, of eating peace offerings, and eating voluntary, being able to bring voluntary sacrifices, uv'maaseh behema, and bringing animal tithes. And they can fulfill their obligation having used money, I think this is what it's saying, having used money of Ma'aseh Sheni. Kohanim can fulfill their obligation by using money of Ma'aseh Sheni to fund chataos, sin offerings, uva'ashamos, and guilt offerings, uva'bechor, and firstborn offerings, uva'chazeh, uva'shok. Number 1 second, nothing to do with Ma'aseh Sheni, my apologies. Let's backtrack a little bit. Yisrael yotzin yedei chavasan. Yisrael can fulfill, Jews can fulfill their obligation of eating peace offerings of the Shalmei Simcha that we were talking about, that fulfills the mitzvah of v'samachta bechagecha, of rejoicing on your festival. They fulfill that mitzvah even if they're eating voluntary offerings, even if they're eating Maaseh Behema, animal tithes, and Kohanim can fulfill this requirement when they're eating sin offerings and guilt offerings and firstborn offerings, uvechazeh v'shok, and when they are given portions of sacrifices, the breast and the thigh, they can fulfill the mitzvah v'samachta bechagecha by eating these things. However, says the Mishnah, aval lo ba'ofos v'lo b'menachos, they do not fulfill this obligation if they are eating birds from sin offerings, or menachos, which are meal offerings, the flour that's brought along alongside different sacrifices. So these things are not considered rejoicing enough, and we all know how much better a good steak is than a bit of chicken leg or bread. So that's Mishnah Dalet. Mishnah Hey. What's the maximum that you can spend on these sacrifices? So that's going to depend on the size of your family and the size of your bank account, basically. So the Mishnah says, Mi sheyesh lo ochlin marubin u'nechasim muatim. A person has many members of the family, but only a small amount of money to be able to spend. Maybe shlamim marubin va'olos muatos. They should prioritize the expenditure on the shlamim sacrifices. And that's because you're going to get some of the meat back to be able to feed your family with. So you should spend more on the shlamim and less on the olas, on the ola offerings, which get completely burnt up. Nechasim merubim va'ochlim muatim. If you have a lot of money and only a few people that you need to feed, then the Mishnah says maybe olos merubos shlamim muatim. Then spend more on the ola and less on the shlamim. Zev zemuat. If you have few people in your house but only a small amount of money, al zen ne'ema ma'achesef ushtei chesef. On this is what we were saying in the previous Mishnah, or when was it? 2 Mishnahs ago. That's what we were talking about when we were talking about the minimum amount that you can spend of 1 silver ma'ah or 2 silver coins. Zev zemerubim. If you have a lot of people in the family and a lot of money, al zen ne'emar. So this is what the verse was talking about when it said in Devarim chapter 16, verse 17. Ish kamatnas yado kevikas Hashem elokecha Hashem nasanach. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. Meaning that if you've been blessed with abundance, then it's good to spend the money on it, because these are wonderful investments from a Jewish perspective, at least. So in Mishnah Vav, we will see later on that there is a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai regarding the Olas Re'iyah on the first day of Yom Tov. But that's only with regards to the Olas Re'iyah. With regards to the Korban Chagigah, that must be brought on the first day. So the Mishnah says, Mi shelo chag b'Yom Tov harishon shel chag. Anyone who did not bring the Korban Chagigah on the first day of a festival, the Mishnah says, Chogeg es kol haregel v'Yom Tov ha'acharon shel chag. You actually have the whole rest of that time to be able to bring the Korban Chagigah. So you're supposed to bring it on the first day, but if you didn't, then I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we're saying that you have the rest of the Chag to bring it. So that's with regards to the Chagigah, and that's with regards to the Olas Re'iyah as well. Continues the Mishnah. Avar haregel v'lo chag. What if you get through the whole of the particular Yom Tov and you haven't brought it? Eino chayav b'achar. The Mishnah says that there is no requirement to make up for it and to replace it. Al zen ne'emar. This is what the verse in Koheles is referring to when it says me'uvas lo yuchal litkon v'chesron lo yuchal lihimanos. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is lacking cannot be counted. Meaning that if you've missed the opportunity, then this is an example of something that cannot be fixed. And in Mishnah Zion, we then actually see some other, we see a digression to talk about things that are considered to not be fixable and not be correctable. So, based off this verse, me'uvas lo yuchal litkon v'cheson lo yuchal limanos, that crooked things cannot be made straight. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says, Ezehu me'uvas she'ino yachol litkon. What are we talking about? What are the examples when we say that something which is crooked cannot be made straight? And the Mishnah answers, Zehaba al ha'erva v'holid mimenu mamzer. An example of this would be a person who is intimate with an erva, with someone who is forbidden to him, v'holed mimenu mamzer, and they give birth to a mamzer. So this is an example of something that cannot be fixed. Even though Hashem might forgive the couple for what they have done, the child will always be an ever-present reminder and proof of the Aveira, of the transgression which occurred. It cannot ever really be made straight again if it's now all warped and bent out of shape. That's the analogy, and that's an practical example of what the verse is talking about. Continues the Mishnah. Im Toma begonev v'gozel yacholhu lahachazira v'itakin. So if you wanted to say that it's referring to someone who steals or robs, so even though that's a bad situation, that's a crooked situation, he could nonetheless return what he stole and fix the sin as if it had never happened. But something which can never be straightened, that would be an example where there's an enduring proof and evidence of the mistake, of the transgression that was made. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, Ein korin me'uvas, we only call something crooked, only if it was something which was initially straight and then became crooked. Ve'ezer, and what would be an example of this? What's this referring to? This refers to a Torah scholar who leaves and separates himself from the Torah. So that's an example of something that was straight, which then became crooked. So that's Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's opinion, that it has to have been something which at least started off straight before it then became crooked. So that's the practical example of the wording in the verse. The final Mishnah of Perek Rishon, the first Perek. So what we see with the Korban Chagigah, excuse the noise, what we see with the Korban Chagigah is that there are very few Pesukim that tell us the halachas that we need to know. So this is not something unusual, and this is what the Mishnah is coming to point out. There are some areas of halacha which are not discussed in great depth or in any great length in the actual Torah. We rely on the oral law to be able to support the practical implications of these halachas. On the other hand, there are some topics where there are loads of rules in the Torah. And so that's what this Mishnah talks about as we finish off chapter 1. Heter nedarim parchin ba'avir. When it comes to the halachot of it says dissolution of vows. Well, is there a better word for dissolution or dissolving of releasing? That's a great word, thank you. Of releasing people from vows. So those halachas, parchin ba'avir, they are dangling in the air. And there is not a great deal written explicitly in the Torah that supports them. So that's an example of an area where there may be lots of rules and it's a weighty halachic topic, but if you wanted to just open up the Chumash and see what you needed to do, you're not going to get very far. Hilchos Shabbos, what about the halachas of Shabbos and Chagigos and the laws of Chagigah, of the Korban Chagigah, V'hama'ilos, and the misuse of temple consecrated property, Harehem kahararim hatzluyin basa'ara. They are examples of things that are like mountains suspended by a hair. They have few pasukim, but they have many halachot. Shehin mikra mu'at, they have few verses, v'halachos merubas, but many, many laws. Continues the Mishnah with the final part of our perek, hadinin. When it comes to monetary law, v'ha'avodos hataharos v'hatumos. When it comes to service and the rules of purity and impurity, v'arayos, and the halachas of forbidden relationships, yesh lahen amashi yismachu. They have a lot of rules, a lot of things talked about in the Torah, and they have a lot of halachas as well. So the point here is that they are heavily supported by the Torah, by the written Torah itself. However, importantly, the Mishnah finishes off, Hein Gufei Torah. These are all parts of the Torah. These are all essential parts of the Torah, whether they are only briefly mentioned in the written law and amply discussed in the oral law. Whatever the case might be, these are all Torah. These are all as important to us as each other. Mazel tov, ladies and gentlemen, on completing chapter 1 of Maseches Chagigah. We move on straight away, diving straight into chapter 2. So continuing from what we were just talking about in terms of different topics that have different amounts of verses and different amounts of oral explanation. So we continue straight in with the following. Ein darshin ba'arayos bishlosha. When it comes to darshaning, when it comes to expounding on the verses in the Torah that deal with arayos, that deal with forbidden relationships, then you should have 3 people at least in the group that you are teaching. Sorry, let me try that one again. Ein darshin ba'arayos bishlosha. You should not teach and expound on arayos if you have got 3 people who you are teaching. And the reason is that you run the risk of some of that group switching off. So if one person asks a question and you're talking about an extremely important topic like forbidden relationships, biblically forbidden relationships, and you've got multiple people there, and one person asks a question, so then the other 2 may not be concentrating, and then they may not absorb the right teachings and the right halachas, and then they may go and make mistakes, which could be horrendous. So the Mishnah says, Ein darshin ba'arayos bishlosha. You shouldn't teach this topic if you have got 3 or more individuals listening in. V'lo b'maaseh bereishis b'shnayim. And you shouldn't teach the maaseh bereishis, the act of creation, the secrets of the beginning of the world, to a group of 2 or more individuals. V'lo b'merkava b'yachid. And you shouldn't even, you shouldn't learn or teach this topic of the merkava, of the divine chariot, which is the first chapter, if I'm not mistaken, of Yechezkel. Shouldn't teach that or try and tackle that topic on your own. Unless the teacher is capable, unless they are wise, unless they understand the topic in its depth and in its breadth, so that they can handle and have it on their shoulders the weighty matter in which they are trying to teach and trying to learn. If they are not capable, we shouldn't be turning to them, which I guess, in a nutshell, is evidence in the Mishnah that when it comes to all of these fancy Kabbalah initiatives, and the Merkava is an example of Kabbalah. So one has to be careful with the type of teacher that you are learning from, which is why I always say to you, if you want to know the answers, get a real rabbi. But hey, you keep coming back week after week.
For the best we can afford.
That's right. Says that. Thank you very much, Charlie. To the millions watching on YouTube. Says the Mishnah, anyone analyzing in great detail, but arba dvarim, in these 4 matters, ra'ui lo ki'ilu lo bala olam. This is heavy stuff, guys. Get ready. Anyone who analyzes these 4 matters in great deal, it would be fitting if they had not come to the world. It would have been. It says there, it would have been better for them if they had not come to the world. What are these 4 things? Says the Mishnah, Mala Mala, what is above you? Mala Mata, what is below you? Mala Fanim, what is, what's before creation? Umala Achor, and what is after the end of the world. So these 4 matters, one could waste their life if they try to get an understanding. Now, this doesn't mean, well, from what I can understand, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask questions, and this doesn't mean that we shouldn't show an interest, but I believe what the Mishnah is driving at is that if you are planning to spend your entire life waiting to have a level of expertise in these areas, and perhaps a person might say, I'm not going to I'm not going to really involve myself in a true Jewish life unless I understand these four things. That, I believe, is what the Mishnah is driving at. You will be wasting your life because these are things which are so difficult for us to understand. These things are so complex, these things are so deep, that for one to make a decision that they are going to spend their entire life trying to analyze and try and understand these things to the exclusion of all else, then the Mishnah is saying that they would have been better off not coming to the world.
Lots of people do.
Pardon me?
Isn't that what lots of people do? Try to understand the meaning of these things.
Do you mean to the exclusion of everything else, or do you mean as part of?
No, not as the exclusion of everything else, but as in part. In part.
Yes, people do, and that's what I'm saying. I don't think we're trying to say over here that people shouldn't ask questions, I don't think that's what we're trying to discourage. But I guess there's the Mishnah is trying to point out that there should be an acceptable level of emunah, an acceptable level of faith, and an acceptable level of trust in the divine plan, that whatever the answers might be, one does not need to spend their entire existence trying to grapple with exclusively those four questions. I believe that is what we're driving at. It says here in my book over here, with some additional notes, that these things are not within the realm of finite understanding. And so because of the dangers of where these topics can take a person in terms of shaking their fundamental beliefs, shaking their faith, shaking their trust in Hashem, the Mishnah is saying better not to get involved with them. But again, if somebody is able to handle the weight of these topics, if somebody is able to find teachers who are capable of handling these topics, it's a very different story. But fundamentally, we're not able to really understand the true depths of these four matters with our finite understandings. So I believe that is the thrust of the Mishnah. And in a similar vein, someone who has no concern for the honor of his maker, someone who has no respect for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, also deserves, also would have been fitting that they should have never come into the world. Says the Mishnah, it's great, deep stuff. We don't shy away from it. Mishnah base. So when it comes to bringing a korban, when it comes to bringing sacrifices, generally, there are three exceptions that I've got in my notes here. Generally, a korban would always have the mitzvah of smicha. The first step in the process would be to rest one's body weight on the animal. There's a machlokes if it should be done immediately before bringing it or not. If it does not have to be, if it does have to be done immediately before it, then there is a concern that the animal might be muktzah, and then that would be something that you can't do. If the animal is muktzah, then you wouldn't be able to lean your body weight on this animal if you were bringing it on a day when animals were muktzah. So this is very interesting because the Mishnah is going to bring 5 groups of Chachmei Yisrael, of the wisest of our people, over 5 generations, 5 different generations, where the matter of whether one should perform smicha, whether one should do this on Yom Tov or not, and it's unresolved. It was unresolved until the time of Hillel. So this is very famous, and it's amazing to be able to see it inside in the Mishnah. The question of whether one should do smicha immediately before the sacrificing of an animal that you are sacrificing on Yom Tov. Or is it muksa? Says the Mishnah, Yossi ben Yoezer Omer shelo lismach. Yossi ben Yoezer said you shouldn't do smicha. Yossi ben Yochanan Omer lismach. Yossi ben Yochanan said you should. So that's the first generation. Then it continues. It was unresolved into the second generation. Yoshua ben Parachia Omer shelo lismach. He said you shouldn't do smicha. Nitai ha'abeli said lismach. He said that you should do it. Yehuda ben Tabai Omer shelo lismach. Yehuda ben Tabai said you shouldn't. Shimon ben Shetach Omer lismach. Shemaya Omer lismach. Avtalion Omer shelo lismach. Now we come to the next generation, the fifth generation, which is Hillel and very good. All right, we're tempted to say it should be Hillel and Shammai, but actually, interestingly, Hillel u'Menachem. Hillel u'Menachem did not disagree. Lo nechlaku. They did not disagree. Who's Menachem? So Menachem was the Av Beis Din, the head of the Beis Din before Shammai. And I have it in my notes here that he was taken out to do the king's service. I think he was taken out to be part of the army. And so he was replaced with Shammai. Yatsa Menachem, Nichnas Shammai. And Shammai replaced him. Shammai Omer shelo lismach. He said you should not do smicha. Hillel Omer lismach. Hillel says one should do smicha. And the halacha ultimately would go like Hillel. Harishonim hayunasim. When we list these 5 generations, the first part of each couplet, of each pairing, was the Nasi of the Jewish people. And the Shneim, the second name in each of those pairings, Ushneim Lahem Avos Beis Din, would be the head of the Beis Din, underneath the Nasi. And if you go through the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, you will see none other than those very rabbis listed as the chain of transmission progressed from one generation to the next. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Gimel, we mentioned before, there's a machlokes if the Olas Re'iyah would be brought on Yom Tov, and here it is. Beis Shammai Omrim, Beis Shammai say, Mevi'in Shlamim ve'ein somchin aleihem, that one can bring a korban shlamim on Yom Tov, but you don't do smicha. Aval lo olas, but you should not bring the burnt offerings, the ones that are entirely burnt up. So Beis Shammai's opinion is that you would only bring the sacrifices that can ultimately make some of it available to people for eating. Ubeis Hillel Omrim, Mevi'in Shlamim, you can bring the Shlamim, Va'olos, and also the Korban Olos, V'somchin Aleim, and you can do smicha on these animals. Mishnah Daled. By way of introduction to Mishnah Daled, everyone says you cannot bring private korbanos on Shabbos. You can't bring private korbanos on Shabbos. Therefore, if it's Yom Tov, it gets pushed off. Let's have a look at what I'm talking about in Mishnah Daled. Says the Mishnah, At Seres Shachal Liyos Be'erev Shabbos. If Shavuos falls on a Friday, then Beis Shammai Omrim Yom Tavoach Achar HaShabbos. Then the day of slaughtering, which would be the first opportunity to bring the Olas Re'iyah, that should be done on Sunday. So let me try and get this right. If the Olas Re'iyah is a private sacrifice, and we're saying we can't bring it on Yom Tov, and if the first day of Yom Tov is a Friday, then the next available opportunity can't be brought because it's Shabbos. So the day that you bring it would have to be on the Sunday. And generally speaking, if you're pushing off the slaughter day, then you have to treat that day like a Yom Tov in terms of not being allowed to fast and in terms of not being able to do eulogies. But there's a problem. And what's our problem? The problem is that there were a group of people called the Sudukim who celebrated Shavuos every year on a Sunday. Why did they celebrate Shavuos every year on a Sunday? Because we say about Sfiras HaOmer, Usfartem lachem mimacharas hashabas, that you should count for yourselves the Omer mimacharas hashabas, which they translated literally as the day after Shabbos, which is a Sunday. So the Tzaddukim took this verse extremely literally and said that the first day of the Omer has to be a Sunday, which means that Shavuos has to be a Sunday. And so because there were these groups of people who celebrated Shavuos every year on the Sunday, if you were having to bring this sacrifice on the Sunday, we're going to see that they would have to tone down the Yom Tov element, the Simcha, as it were, element of this Olas Re'iyah. So the concern was that if we're pushing this Korban off till the Sunday, then all of the celebratory aspects need to be toned down. So says the Mishnah, you got Shavuos falling on a Friday. Beis Shammai omrim Yom Tov achar Shabbos. The day of sacrificing has to be done on the Sunday. Uveis Hillel omrim ein Yom Tov achar Shabbos, that the day of slaughtering would not be after the Shabbos, because they would say that it can be performed on the festival itself, and so it can be done on the Shabbos. Umodim, but they would agree that if the Shavuos would fall out on a Shabbos, then the day of sacrificing would go onto the Sunday. But because we're having to do it on the Sunday, we're going to tone it down because of these Tzaddukim. The high priest would not wear his festive garments, but would wear a regular uniform, so as not to play up this occasion. And they would be allowed to give eulogies and to fast on this day. In order to not give credence to the Saddukim, to the Sadducees, who would insist on marking Shavuos and marking this day only exclusively on a Sunday. So that's what they were trying to avoid. So now, guys, we are up to chapter 2, Mishnah 5, which, as I said, is when the topic switches to Tumah and Tahara. So we are going to be dealing with purity from here on in. And one of the reasons why we deal with purity and impurity is because there's this idea that we need to be pure when we get to the Beis HaMikdash. So we include it at the end of this Masechta because we're dealing with topics of coming to the Beis HaMikdash, and we want people to be prepared, and we want them to be pure in time for Yom Tov so that they can bring korbanos. But we're going to be dealing with other laws as well. So here we go, guys. Fundamentally, biblically, you're either tahor or tameh. You are either pure or impure. But rabbinically, there are many levels. There are, in fact, 5 levels of tumah and tahara. And as you get further and further down in the hierarchy of tumah and tahara, you get to a point where hands become problematic. As I said, fundamentally, your body is either pure or it's impure. Rabbinically, your hands could be in a state of ritual impurity. And that was because they didn't want people to handle kodshin, to handle sacrifices, to handle consecrated items with dirty hands or with impure hands. And this also was the case for terumah. They wanted people to be handling these things in a state of purity. And so they extended the potency of tumah to lower and lower levels to encourage and ensure that people would be in states of ritual purity when handling these important things. So the Mishnah says it's going to list 4 purposes that people would have to wash their hands for. So the first is Notlin layadayim lechulin v'lamase v'latruma. A person would have to wash their hands in order to eat chulin, in order to eat unsanctified food, bread, vilamase, and also to be able to consume tithed produce, vilatruma, and also to be able to consume, if you're a kohen, to be able to consume truma. Vilakodesh, but when it comes to level 4, which is to consume and eat sacrificial food, then it's not enough just to wash our hands like we do with a cup, but bilin, one should immerse their hands into a mikveh to be able to have hands pure enough, as it were, to be able to consume these things. Velachatas, when it comes to being able to eat a korban chatas, which is a 5th level, right? Being able to handle the water that was used to sprinkle people who were impure. So the Mishnah says, "Im nitzma'u yadav nitma gufa," that if your hands were impure, then your whole body would be considered impure. And the only way around that then is to be able to put your whole body into a mikvah. And this was all done so that you would be careful and ensure that everyone is not touching what they shouldn't be touching. So even though, as we get to Mishnah Vav, even though the minimum requirement for people to ensure that they had this bodily purity was for Maaseh Sheni and upwards, even so, there were people who were very careful, and they would make sure that they were in a full state of ritual bodily purity to be able to eat even chulin, things which had not been designated for sacred use. But it's all going to depend on the kavanah of when you go to the mikveh. It's all going to depend on what you had in mind to be purifying yourself for, which is going to determine what you can eat. So the Mishnah says, Hatovel l'chulin, if a person went to the mikveh intending to make themselves pure for eating chulin, for eating non-sacred food, v'huchsak l'chulin, and is now in a presumptive status of being pure to eat non-sacred food, Mishnah says, asur l'maaseh, they now cannot eat tithed produce unless they purify themselves further. So even though they didn't have to purify and go to the mikveh for this, if they have done, then they are going to have a status of being able to eat chulin, but not for anything else. They're going to have to immerse again. Taval l'maaseh, if a person went to the mikveh intending to be fit for v'huchsak l'maaseh, with the status of eating maaseh, and therefore also chulin, which is less than that, asur l'truma, they can't have teruma until they've gone to the mikveh with the kavanah to be pure for teruma. Taval l'truma, if they go to the mikveh to be able to eat teruma or maaseh or chulin, v'huchsak l'truma, they're now at a status of teruma, asur l'kodesh, they can't eat sacrificial food. Taval l'kodesh, if they went to the mikveh for kodesh and for truma and for maaseh and for chulin, v'huchsak l'kodesh, and they're now at this point asur l'chatas, they are still not able to come into contact with the purification waters for chatas. Taval l'chamur, if you went to the mikveh and your intention was to be able to be considered as that most strictest level, then mutar lakal, then you are permitted for anything underneath it. Taval v'lo huchsak, if you went to immerse in a mikveh, but you did not have any intention whatsoever to accept upon yourself a status, then the Mishnah says, Ki'ilu lo taval, then it's as if you have not immersed at all. There has to be an element of kavanah, of intention, when going to the mikveh, to be able to be presumed tahor, to be able to consume whatever it was that you wanted to consume. Mishnah Zion, our final Mishnah for this evening, our final Mishnah for chapter 2, extends this 5-level status, as it were, to clothing as well. So if a person is living in a house where they are maintaining a state of ritual purity and they want everything to be pure, you still have to be concerned about clothing. Why do you have to be concerned about clothing? Because this person presumably would have a wife. And if he has a wife, then this wife would have a menstruation cycle. She would become a nidah. And if she becomes a nidah, then there is such a thing called tumas medras or midras. Tumas midras is a type of ritual impurity which is given to people who have different types of discharges. So a nida who has a menstrual discharge is considered to be at risk of contracting tumas midras. A yoledes, someone who gives birth, is equally in this category, as is a zav and a zava. Zav and a zava are people who have these particular types of discharges. So when they are in this state of ritual impurity, if they are a zav, a zava, a nida, or yoledes, so their level is extremely high. They become an av hatuma, which is kind of like the top tier of impurity. And anything that they rest their weight on, they are able to transfer impurity to those items, right? Which means if they sit on cushions or they sit on different things, or they rest their weight on clothing, whatever it might mean, the impurity can transfer to these begadim, to these garments, to these things that they rest their weight on. Yeah? So the Mishnah says, Big day on haaretz, if you have garments of an am haaretz, one who is not careful with the laws of ritual purity, then the Mishnah says, midras la prushin. Anything that they could have come into contact with as a zav, a zava, a nida, or yoledes, is going to be considered to have impurity for someone who is of a level of a prushin, someone who is careful, someone who is scrupulous. So anyone who is scrupulous about ritual impurity would have to be very, very careful going near these items if those items belonged to an am haaretz, because you couldn't be certain that these things were definitely pure. Big day Purushin, midras l'ochlei truma. If you have garments belonging to a parush, somebody who is scrupulous with ritual purity, they are still going to nonetheless have a status of tumas midras for people who eat truma, for kohanim, essentially. And that's because they need to really make sure that their family is in a state of purity to be able to eat truma. Big day ochlei truma, if you are a family who are eating truma, your begadim are going to have a status of midras la kodesh. Then people who are trying to eat sacrifices have to maintain a distance even from those items. Big day kodesh midras lechatas, and items belonging to a kodesh leveled person is going to be considered midras for a person wanting to prepare the waters of purification. Yosef ben Yoezer hayachasid shebekuhuna. Yosef ben Yoezer was one of the big machas of the Kohanim. He was one of the most pious people out there. And even his mitpachat, even his cloth, would be considered midras, would be considered impure because of the weight that might have been put on it, for people who were on the level of kodesh, who were on the level of wanting to eat sacrifices. And the Mishnah finishes off, Yochanan ben Gudgada, who was also a big tzaddik, Yochanan ben Gudgada haya ochel al taharas hakodesh kol yamav. He would always maintain his level of ritual purity all of his days. So that in theory, he would be able to eat kodesh at any point. And even for him, even though this guy was maintaining a state of purity just to eat chulin, just to eat things which were not even sanctified, so his garments would be considered impure for people wanting to be on a level of chatas, of being prepared to come into contact with these waters of the ashes of the para aduma. So there we go. We talked before about how the society was very much built around Tumah and Tahara. And these were big realities in temple times. You couldn't really function unless you were paying attention and being mindful of the things that you were coming into contact with, the people that you were coming into contact with, because there were such severe knock-on effects for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, we complete chapter 2. Mazel tov, everybody, on finishing chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Maseches Chagigah. And that's all for this week. So we are going to say to everybody watching tonight, have a wonderful and meaningful week. And we'll see you next time on Mishnah Mastery, where we're going to finish Seder Moed. How exciting!